maybe it's because of the field I'm in, but it seems like everyone everywhere is looking for parenting tips. But if you're not careful, you can find yourself getting parenting tips that harm your child. Nobody wants to harm their kids, but everyone wants to find ways to build better relationships with them and get their needs met as parents. But what happens when your goal is to help your kids, but the tips you receive are actually parenting tips that harm your child? Let's talk about a few of those tips to watch out for today on Just 7 Steps. Hi, I'm Robert Schramm. I am a behavior analyst, education specialist, author, and dad, and I'm also the developer of the 7 Steps to Instructional Motivation. Each week, I provide you with helpful information based on the Just 7 Steps approach. So if you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube channel, take a second, do it right now. I know that you'll be glad that you did. You can find tips and tricks and hints and advice for just about anything on the internet these days. And long before the internet, you could get the same tips, tricks, hacks, and recommendations from friends and family, or even the local bookstore. Unfortunately, not all advice is going to be good, and not everyone offering advice is truly qualified to do so. I can't tell you the number of places I've seen parenting advice come from people who have no education or experience beyond that of raising their own children. Sure, being a parent is helpful in understanding the daily struggles and some of the trials and tribulations of parenting, but does it really make you an expert? I have 2 daughters, both of whom I count as my experience raising kids. But in addition to these 2 young, typically developing girls, I have also directly worked with thousands of children with just about every possible diagnosis out there. Additionally, I have a master's degree in special education. I have worked as a certified teacher and passed advanced coursework and a written test to become a board certified behavior analyst. This certification requires that I maintain a high level of continuing education, as well as regarding the latest research and ethical concerns. And I've been board certified for just under 20 years. All of this gives me a unique perspective that allows me to filter my advice, tips, and recommendations through a large body of research and experience. I can't imagine if I was trying to advise people on parenting based on just my own experiences with Zoe and Lainey, my 2 daughters. Or even if I was trying to advise people in a larger scheme based on just my experiences with the first 100 kids I'd worked with. So for me, it's very worrisome when people become parenting experts based on how they successfully raised their family of 4. But beyond an expert's qualification, what's more concerning is the types of advice that sometimes get shared. So today I'm going to share with you my top 3 parenting tips that harm your child. And here we go. Tip number 1. Tip 1 is a tip that I hear all the time. It is certainly a parenting tip that will harm your child. This tip is to avoid using reinforcement. When someone recommends that you avoid using reinforcement, I immediately know that they have no formal behavioral education and have no real idea of what reinforcement truly is. My guess is that by saying avoid reinforcement, what they mean is to avoid promising reinforcers or to make deals or bribes up front before getting a behavior. But unfortunately, anyone who knows what reinforcement is can tell you that that's not reinforcement. Reinforcement can only happen after a behavior and not before. And therefore, bribes, deals, and promises are not reinforcement. If someone is telling you not to use reinforcement, and they truly mean not to allow reinforcement to follow behavior that you want to see more of, then they have no understanding of reinforcement, because something is only described as a reinforcer because of the effect it has on behavior. And that effect is that it increases it. Therefore, anything at all that happens after a behavior and increases that behavior in the future is a reinforcer. So it's impossible to not use reinforcement. Any behavior that is happening more and more is being reinforced. You just are not in control of it, and therefore you can't use it to benefit your child's development. The final option for people who say don't use reinforcement is perhaps someone who is meaning to say don't use external or extrinsic reinforcement and only use natural or intrinsic reinforcers. Now, if this is the case, this is not necessarily bad advice, because anytime you can count on natural reinforcers to increase behavior you want to see more of, this would be a preferred method. But the problem is, so much of the behavior you want your child to engage in doesn't offer meaningful intrinsic reinforcement. Therefore, what these people end up doing is, instead of offering any positive reinforcement at all, in an attempt to not use extrinsic reinforcement, what they end up doing is using what's called negative reinforcement. And negative reinforcement is something I strongly recommend against using, because in most situations, it's the process of making yourself an annoyance to the child up front, and then just removing your annoyance as the reinforcer when the behavior occurs. In actuality, because this person does not want to give a reward for doing a behavior, they instead choose to nag the child or make themselves an aversive, and then just stop being the annoyance as the reinforcement. So bottom line is, no learning takes place without reinforcement. Principally, this is a fact. So if anyone tells you to avoid using reinforcement as a blanket piece of advice, I recommend you run for the nearest door, because this person has no behavioral education to support them and is just giving advice that is one of the several common parenting tips that can harm your child. Another parenting tip that can actually harm your child is don't ever punish your kids. Again, similar to reinforcement, part of this comes from a misunderstanding of what the term punishment means. If what this person actually means is don't hit, yell at, or embarrass, or maybe lock your child in a closet, then yes, this would be good advice. But when they say don't punish your kids, you are behaviorally rejecting a ton of reactions to behavior that might not only be helpful, but may end up being necessary in some situations. When someone says don't punish your child, it usually means not to focus on the negatives and to try to talk to them and evoke in them a desire to do better through reason. But this is a fine goal to have, but for so many parents and so many children, growing up without any form of limit setting or boundaries is damaging to a child's ability to successfully navigate the social world. I know children who've grown up in a consequence-free household where behavior is never punished in any form, and parents try to talk their children into making better choices. And more often than not, these children grow up without a healthy understanding of the social consequences, and they find themselves struggling just even to navigate the greater social world outside of the family. You can't teach most children to make better choices without some combination of reinforcement for making those better choices and some form of boundary or limit setting related to the negative choices they might make. The complexity of how to do this best is a challenge for even the seasoned behavior analyst. But the idea that someone can give you a blanket, don't ever punish your kids advice tells me that they're very naive about what punishment is or how to set boundaries, or they're just unable to create healthy limits for their kids in meaningful ways. For example, if your child were to bop another child on the head and take their toy, would you consider it inappropriate to take that toy back and give it to the child who was bopped? You would technically be using a form of punishment. If you asked your child to do their homework and you found them on their phone and you took their phone away until the homework was done, guess what? You've just used a form of punishment. To try to tell a parent that these consequences would be wrong at all costs would invariably leave that family with very little in the way of consequences that can help set limits and create healthy boundaries for their children. So of course, these tipsters might say, well, instead of setting limits this way, just explain to your child that hitting is hurtful and that the other child will be unhappy, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, you can and should do this as well. But what happens when you've done this and your kid just keeps on bopping? Limit setting is going to become important to some degree in almost all parenting relationships. And I would not be comfortable taking the advice of someone who says, don't ever punish your kids, because they obviously don't know the many different forms of reduction techniques available to them and likely cannot support you in setting healthy limits with your children. The third and final one of my parenting tips that harm your children relates to spanking or paddling a child. I'm actually a member of a very popular parenting group on Facebook, and there are several parenting coaches in the group who actually advocate for what they call light paddling or spanking of children when they break house rules. This is likely the parenting tip that is the most likely to do harm to an individual child. Although, as I mentioned earlier, we need to become gifted at knowing how and when to reinforce and even offer limits and boundaries to behavior, there really is never a reason or a benefit to hitting a child that outweighs the possible negative effects hitting can cause. It has become quite clear in all recent research that children who are hit by their parents are more likely to lash out physically against others and more likely to distance themselves from their parents as they grow. The last thing you want to do to your child is teach them that violence is an acceptable response to not getting your needs met in a loving relationship. I love you, so I have to hit you is an archaic way of thinking that I would have hoped was no longer a part of any parent's repertoire. Now, I do understand that some children are more challenging than others, and it may be harder to find meaningful consequences for some children that help to set limits. But if you've resorted to hitting, you've given up on building a more positive reciprocal parenting relationship and determined that physical dominance is all you have to work with. It's only a matter of time before your physical threats no longer work or your child decides that they just don't want to be around you anymore. There is a reason that physical violence, even loving spankings, are outlawed in many countries. They're not a necessary tool and should not be a part of what you want to do as a parent. If you have someone advising you to spank or paddle your kids, you need to reconsider if this person is actually someone who can help you, because they are offering you a parenting tip that harms your child. So please remember that understanding reinforcement and reduction procedures is an important part of becoming a better, more consistent parent to your children. If you want to know more about these principles and how they can help you, come check out my no-cost workshop called How to Get Your Kids to Listen Without Raising Your Voice or Nagging. And it's available today at the Just 7 Steps website. Just go to just7steps.com/workshop for access to this free workshop today. And if someone is telling you that they were spanked or hit as a child and they turned out all right, I would counter this argument with, if you're advocating for unnecessarily hitting a child by his parents, then I would argue that you didn't turn out all that great. Instead of resorting to hitting or bad advice from people who've done a good job with their kids, go to just7steps.com/workshop and get a free, almost hour-long workshop from a parent, behavior analyst, and educator with more than 20 years of experience in the field, and learn how to get your kids to listen to you without raising your voice or nagging them. So if you like this video blog, I would love it if you would leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up, share the video with others who might also benefit, and subscribe to this channel for more awesome videos just like this one. I'll see you right here next week, but only if you remember to subscribe.